This is a safe zone, so you can't just quit right away. Instead, you have to take turns watching each other's back. When one person logs out, the other can keep their empty character safe. Got it, you can go first, Lifa. Someone said. Okay, see you in 20 minutes. Lifa opened her window and clicked the log out button. The warning message popped up, but she agreed to log out anyway. The world around her started to fade away, getting smaller and smaller until it disappeared. Shuga suddenly woke up in her bed and jumped up, feeling super impatient. She quickly removed her special gaming headset, called an atmosphere. She slipped out of the room and crept down the stairs. The house was quiet because Midori was still working on her magazine, trying to meet a looming deadline, and Kazuto was holed up in his room. Downstairs everything was silent. She headed to the kitchen, opening the fridge to grab some food. Out came 2 bagels, sliced ham, mustard, and a few veggies. Quickly she sliced the bagels, spread a thin layer of mustard on each, and then piled on the ham and vegetables, to make herself a tasty snack. She carefully placed each bagel sandwich on its own plate. Next she poured some milk into a pan and put it on the stove. Then she headed back upstairs. Hey big brother, what's for dinner? She asked. But there was no answer. She shrugged her shoulders and went back downstairs to the kitchen, thinking he must be sleeping. Shuga poured the warm milk into a big mug and headed to the living room table, where her food was waiting. She took a quick moment to say thanks, then gobbled down her simple dinner in about 90 seconds. After that she tossed her dish into the sink and rushed to the bathroom. Even though she was just playing a game in a virtual world, the intense battles made her sweat like crazy, so she always had to clean up and change clothes after a long gaming session. She quickly peeled off her clothes and jumped into the shower, blasting hot water right onto her head. Her mom Midori would be super upset if Shuga let her online games distract her from eating or taking care of herself. That's why Shuga made sure to plan any group activities for earlier in the day, so she could focus on real life in the evenings. This adventure with Kirito was going to be a long one. It would last all day tomorrow and maybe even the day after that. Usually Shuga wasn't a fan of playing with her friends for such a long time. She got bored easily, and didn't like doing things that took up too many days. But something about this trip felt different. As she stood in the shower, the warm water pouring over her face, she realized she was actually excited. I'm really looking forward to it, she told herself. When she opened her eyes, she stared back at her own reflection in the mirror right in front of her. As she looked into those dark eyes, she saw a mix of excitement and a little nervousness. Shuga wasn't super tall for a kendo player, but compared to Lifa, she seemed pretty sturdy. When she shifted her shoulders, stomach, or thighs, you could see the muscles rippling just beneath her skin. Shuga noticed that her body was changing. Her breasts seemed to be getting bigger. This made her feel weird, like her body was showing how mixed up she felt inside. She closed her eyes tightly, trying to shake off the feeling. But then she thought about what was really going on. It wasn't about having a crush on someone. It was about being excited for a new adventure that was just around the corner. The fact that someone she knew would be by her side was just a bonus, not the main reason she was looking forward to it. She really meant it when she said that's all. Those words were true, not just something she told herself to feel better. Looking back, every day was an adventure. As she got stronger, she could do more and more things. She loved flying through the sky over new places. It was such a thrill, but as she became one of the best sylphs in the game, things got complicated. With great power came big headaches. She felt like she was just going through the motions, doing what she thought she was supposed to do. It was like she had a weight tied to her wings, holding her back. This weight was the duty to fight for her people. There was a word that bothered her, renegade. It was an English word that meant someone who abandoned their home and family, but it also meant heretic, or someone who didn't believe in what others believed. She used to think that people who gave up on their duties were traitors. They would get kicked out of their communities for not doing what they were supposed to do. Now she wondered if those people were really just following their own sense of pride. As she thought about all this, she washed her hair and body, scrubbing away the soap suds. Her hands kept moving, but her mind was somewhere else. She snatched a dry towel from the wall and started messing with the panel next to it. Suddenly a vent in the ceiling roared to life, blasting hot air down on her. As her hair dried, she wrapped herself up in the big towel and made a dash for the living room. She glanced at the clock. 17 minutes had already flown by out of the 20 she had. Shuga quickly wrapped the other sandwich in plastic and tore off a note from the pad. She scribbled a quick note that said, "Eat this if you get hungry. big brother, and tucked it under his plate. Then she rushed upstairs to change into some fresh clothes. As soon as she was dressed, she jumped onto her bed and put on the Atmosphere headset. It was still in standby mode, waiting for her to start playing. The connection test seemed to take forever. But finally, she passed through a rainbow-colored ring and entered the game. A gentle breeze blew across the virtual plains, making Lifa feel like she was really there. She stood up from her starting pose, a one-legged crouch, and asked, "Thanks for waiting. Are there any monsters around?" Kirito was chillin' on the grass, sucking on a weird green straw thingy. He pulled it out of his mouth and said, "Nope, all quiet here." His friend asked, "What's that thing?" Kirito explained, "I grabbed a bunch of them at a store before we left. The shopkeeper said they were super special, and only found in Swilvan." His friend was curious. "I've never heard of that." Kirito tossed the green straw to her, wanting her to check it out. She quickly caught it and popped it into her mouth. Trying to look calm, the breath mint tasted sweet and pepperminty. "Time for me to log out," she said. "Thanks for keeping watch." Her friend replied, "No problem, see you soon." As he logged out, his body bent into a crouch, like it was waiting for something to happen. Lifa sat down next to Kirito and looked up at the sky, taking a puff from her minty pipe. Suddenly a tiny fairy popped out of Kirito's shirt pocket. Lifa was startled. "Wow, you can move around on your own without Kirito?" she asked. The little fairy Yui nodded confidently, putting her hands on her hips. "Of course I can," she said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "I'm me, after all." "He's not my boss, he's my papa," I said. Someone asked me, "Why do you call him Papa? Did he tell you to?" I thought about it for a moment before answering. "Papa saved me. He said I was his kid, so that makes him my papa." The person nodded and said, "I see. But I don't think they really understood." Then they asked me, "Do you love your papa?" It sounded like a simple question, but you gave them a super serious stare. "What does love mean, anyway?" she asked. The person was caught off guard. Well, it means you want to be with someone all the time," they replied after a pause. Your heart beats super fast when you're around that special person. For Lifa, it was Kazuto's smile that popped into her head. But then something weird happened. His face mixed with the avatar kneeling next to her, Kirito. She held her breath as she realized something surprising. The secret feeling she had for Kazuto might be happening with Kirito too. Lifa shook her head, trying to clear the confusing thoughts swirling inside her. Yui looked confused. "What's wrong, Lifa?" she asked. Lifa quickly replied, "And nothing at all." But then she let out a loud yelp. The next thing that happened was Kirito waking up. "What's nothing?" he asked, looking at Lifa with curiosity. Lifa freaked out when she saw Kirito sit up. She jumped into the air and shouted, "A thaw!" Kirito stood up, acting like nothing was wrong, and asked Lifa, "Did anything happen?" Yui was still sitting on his shoulder and said, "Welcome back, Papa. Lifa and I were just talking about." But before she could finish, Lifa cut her off. I said it was nothing," she said hurriedly. "Hey, you're back already. Did you even eat?" she asked Kirito, trying to change the subject. "Yeah, my family left some food out for me," he replied. She smiled and said, "That's really nice of them. Okay, let's get moving. If we don't make it to the mining town soon, it'll be a hassle to log out later." She started walking quickly, saying, "Come on, we're almost at the cave entrance." Kirito and Yui were surprised by her sudden hurry. She flapped her wings to get moving, but he just stood there.
"Okay, fine," he said finally, looking a bit unsure.
He stretched out his own wings, but then he turned back to the forest they had just left.
"What's wrong?" she asked, noticing his weird expression.
He scrunched up his face and scanned the trees, like he was searching for something.
"I don't know," he said slowly. "I just feel like
"Someone's been spying on us." "Kirito!" exclaimed. "Yui, are there any other players around?" he asked the tiny pixie beside him. Yui shook her head. "Nope, I'm not picking up any signals." But instead of feeling better, Kirito looked even more worried. Lifa noticed and asked, "You really think someone's watching us? Do you have a special instinct in this game or something?" Kirito scratched his chin thoughtfully. "It's definitely possible," he said. "Think about it, if someone was watching you, wouldn't you want to know how they're doing it?" The system needs to scan us so it can read the data and give it to him. Some people think that your brain can feel this happening, but that's just a theory. If you say so, someone replied, sounding unsure. But if you didn't see anyone, then maybe it was all just imagination. It could have been a tracer though, she said quietly. Kirito's eyebrows shot up in surprise. What's a tracer? He asked. It's a special kind of tracking spell, she explained. This magic spell sends out a tiny helper that finds its target and reports back to the person who cast it. That's really handy. Someone said, can't you just get rid of it? Well, if you can see the tracker, then yeah. You can make it stop. But the stronger the magician is, the farther away they can send the spell. Out here in the open, it would be almost impossible to catch and stop it. I guess I might have just been imagining things. One of them said, let's keep moving. The other person agreed, and they took off into the air. The white mountain range towered above, its cliffs as steep as they could be. And right in the middle of it all was a massive black cave that seemed to swallow all the light around it. Lifa flapped her wings and zoomed towards the spooky cave, which sent shivers down her spine. As she flew closer, the chill from the cave grew stronger. Soon, Lifa and her friends reached the entrance, a perfect square hole cut into the side of the mountain. It was so precise that it looked like a giant had carved it out with a massive chisel. This massive cave was 3 or 4 times taller than Lifa, stretching out in every direction. As they got closer, they noticed something creepy. The walls were covered in weird carvings of monsters. Looking up, a gigantic demon head loomed overhead, its mean face scaring anyone who dared to enter. What's this cave called? Kirito asked, his voice filled with curiosity. I think it's called the Lugru Corridor, came the reply. Lugru is the name of the city down here. Ah, Kirito said, taking it all in. He flashed a big grin and said, this is just like an old fantasy movie. Lifa gave him a sideways glance. She had a feeling she knew exactly which movie he was talking about. Probably that super popular trilogy based on some really old books. She remembered that Kazuto had the entire collector's edition box set, and she had even sneaked into his room to watch it when no one was looking. I know the one, she said with a smile. They journeyed through the mountains and entered an old underground mine. But instead of a giant fire demon, they found something else. You won't find any demons here, someone said with a grin. Another person replied, that's a shame. Then Lifa spoke up. But we do have orcs. If you're looking for a fight, I can let you take care of them. She turned her head and started walking into the cave. The air inside was cool and damp, and the sunlight from outside didn't shine very far into the passage. Darkness surrounded them, making it hard to see. Just as she was about to cast a light spell, an idea popped into her head. Hey Kirito, have you been practicing your magic skills? She asked. Kirito hesitated for a moment before responding. Yeah. I got some basic magic from this race, but I haven't used it much. She smiled, thinking about their situation. You know, Spriggans are really good at using magic in tight spaces like caves and dungeons, she said. Your wind magic isn't going to cut it. You need a better light spell. Kirito looked puzzled and scratched his head. Hey Yue, what should I use? He asked. Yue popped out of his pocket and started talking like a teacher. First, Papa, you should really read the manual. The light spell is Luminary. She said each part of the word clearly so Kirito could understand. Then it was Kirito's turn to try. He held up his hand and repeated the words. But it sounded a bit awkward. A faint glow began to spread from Kirito's hand, filling the air with a soft light. As it wrapped around Lifa's body, she could suddenly see much more clearly in the dark. This wasn't just any ordinary light. It was a special night vision spell that supercharged their sight. Lifa was impressed. Wow. That's really useful. I guess Spriggans aren't so bad after all. Kirito pretended to be hurt. Hey, that kind of hurts. Lifa just laughed. But seriously, you should learn the spells you have. Even if they're not the strongest, they could still make a big difference when it counts. Kirito joked back. Yeah. I get it. You think Spriggan magic is weak, but it might just save our lives someday. As they made their way down the twisting passage, they kept teasing each other. Before long, the light from the entrance faded out of sight. Kirito started studying the glowing purple game manual, trying to memorize a new spell. Ardinar She, he muttered to himself. Lifa looked over at him. You're not going to get it right. If you just stumble over the words, don't try to memorize them like a robot. Really learn what they mean. Imagine being able to cast powerful spells just by combining special words. It sounds cool, but for one gamer it was a total buzzkill. He had been trying to master the game's magic system, but it felt like learning a whole new language. I play games to escape from memorizing weird vocabulary words, he said, slumping his head in frustration. Things only got worse when he found out that the most powerful spells required stringing together about 20 of these special words. Forget it, I'll just stick to fighting with my sword, he said, throwing up his hands, but his friend wasn't having it. No complaining, start over from the beginning, she said firmly. They had already been stuck in the cave for 2 hours, and it seemed like they still had a long way to go. Leafa and her friends had already battled orcs about 10 times, and it was a piece of cake. They weren't worried about getting lost either. Thanks to the map Leafa bought in Swilvan, the map showed they were close to a huge bridge that went over an underground lake. On the other side of the bridge was the mining city of Lugru. Lugru wasn't as big as the giant underground fortress that was the capital of known territory, but it was still a great place to find valuable ores and minerals. Lots of merchants and crafters liked to visit Lugru because of this. It was weird though, they hadn't seen any other players on their trip so far. The reason was that this cave wasn't a great place to hunt for monsters, and sylphs, a type of player, usually avoided it. Sylphs love to fly, but in the cave, there wasn't enough sunlight or moonlight to refill their wing power. The corridors were big enough to fly around, but without any way to recharge, flying was useless. Most sylphs took a longer route to get to Almos, going north through Kate Sith territory, instead of through the mountains. In the world of Alo, there were cool cat-like creatures called Kate Siths. You could tell them apart by their feline ears and tails. They were super good at taming monsters and animals, which meant they could control them. For a long time, the Kate Siths had been friends with the sylphs, trading them tamed mounts to ride on. The leaders of each territory got along great, and some people even thought they might form an official team soon. Leafa had lots of friends who were Kate Siths, and she thought about asking for their help on her trip. But Kirito was in a big hurry, so she decided to take a shorter route instead. As they traveled through the underground road, Leafa couldn't shake off the feeling of unease. But so far, everything had been moving fast. Kirito was in a huge hurry to get to Alma and the World Tree, but Leafa had no idea why. He wasn't talking much, and when he did, his words were few and vague. It was hard to figure out what was going on in his head. But one thing was clear, Kirito was desperate to get somewhere and fast. She remembered him mentioning that he was searching for someone, but that's all she knew. The way he charged into battles, taking down enemies left and right, showed just how urgent his mission was. Tracking down someone in a game who was hard to find in real life wasn't that weird. Outside the general store there was a bulletin board filled with wanted notices. People posted these notes when they were looking for specific players. Usually it was because they had a score to settle or a crush on someone. But Kirito didn't seem like the type to get into fights or romantic drama. Searching in Alma was a good idea, but why were they heading to the World Tree? It was a place no one had conquered yet. They might make it to the foot of the tree, but reaching the top seemed impossible. Leafa couldn't stop thinking about this mystery. Meanwhile, Kirito stumbled over his spell words. Being distracted in neutral territory was a great way to get into trouble, but luckily Yui was on high alert for any nearby monsters. As they approached the lake, Leafa was still lost in thought, but then she heard a strange sound effect. It was like the ringing of an old phone. She jumped and looked up, calling out to Kirito. I just got a message. Sorry, hang on, Leafa said, stopping in her tracks. She tapped a floating icon near her chest, and a window popped up instantly. She already knew who the message was from, not Tricon, her only friend in the game. As she quickly scanned the words, she expected something boring, but what she saw made her pause, just like we thought. Be careful, as the message cut off suddenly, leaving Leaf, wondering. What is this? She muttered to herself. This message was totally confusing. What was the sender even thinking? It said to be careful, but what did that mean? And why was there a weird semp at the end? If the sender was signing off, it should have been an R, not an S. Did they send the message by mistake before they finished writing it? Or did they just accidentally hit an extra key? The person reading the message muttered to herself. Sense. Shiz. Kirito noticed something was wrong and asked, "What's wrong?" Just as she was about to spill the details, a tiny head popped out of his shirt pocket, It was Yui. Papa, I've got something on my radar, she said. What is it? He asked, his hand resting on the huge sword strapped to his back. Monsters. But Yui shook her head. Nope, not monsters. Players are coming, a whole dozen of them. He was shocked. 12 players. Leafa's eyes widened in surprise. This group was way too big for a normal battle party. Maybe it was a team of sylphs traveling with goods to trade in Lugru or Elmen. Usually a huge caravan would make its way to the center of the map about once a month. But when that happened, everyone knew about it ahead of time. There would be ads for days asking for brave volunteers to join in. She checked the bulletin board this morning. But there was no news about anything suspicious. As long as the mysterious group was made up of sylphs, she didn't have to worry. It was unlikely that a big gang of player killers would be hiding in a deserted place like this. Leafa suddenly felt uneasy. I've got a bad feeling about this, she said. Let's hide and let them pass.
Kirito looked around, confused.
But where can we hide? They were in a long straight hallway with no hiding spots. Leafa just grinned. Don't worry, I've got an idea, she said. Grabbing Kirito's arm, she pulled him towards a small hole in the rock wall. She snuggled in close to him, feeling a little shy, and raised her hand to cast a magic spell. Suddenly, a whirlwind of glittering green air swirled up from the ground and surrounded them. Everything took on a faint green hue. But that was okay, it meant they were almost invisible to anyone looking from the outside. Leafa leaned over to Kirito and whispered, "Be super quiet. If we make too much noise, the spell will be ruined." Kirito nodded and said, "Got it. This spell is really coming in handy." He peeked outside the windy area they were hiding in. Yui's tiny voice came from his pocket. "They'll be here in 2 minutes." Leafa and Kirito flattened themselves against the rock wall. They waited for what felt like forever, their hearts racing. Then Leafa heard the sound of footsteps getting closer and closer. Kirito's head jerked up, his eyes scanning the distance. "What's that?" he whispered. Leafa followed his gaze, but she didn't see anything out of the ordinary. "I don't see anyone," she said. Confusion etched on her face. Kirito's eyes were fixed on something. "Though, it's not a player," he muttered. "It looks like a tiny red bat, but it's so small." Leafa's breath caught in her throat as she finally saw what Kirito was staring at. Her eyes widened in surprise. She squinted into the dark hallway, and her eyes landed on a small red shadow flying towards them. "Crap," she cursed, the word bursting out of her mouth before she could stop it. She quickly rolled out of their hiding spot and into the open hallway. The spell that was keeping them hidden was broken, and Kirito looked up at her in confusion. "Hey, what's going on?" he asked. But she didn't have time to explain. "That thing is a tracing searcher, it's a powerful spell. We need to get rid of it before it finds us." She held out her hands and started chanting, trying to come up with a plan to defeat the spell. A huge list of words poured out, and when it finally stopped, something amazing happened. Emerald green needles shot out of her fingertips like a barrage of tiny rockets. They zoomed through the air, heading straight for the red shadow. The bat dodged and weaved, trying to avoid getting hit, but there were just too many needles. Eventually some of them struck their mark, sending the bat tumbling to the ground. As it landed, a small flame erupted, engulfing the tiny creature.